Welcome, APUSHers, to the Age of Affluence, 1953, to the end of the Eisenhower presidency. This is lecture 27, and we'll be tackling part two of this lecture.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike.
Okay, enough of that. I think we're done with the Ike song. Part two of our lecture is titled One of Us, and we're going to be taking a look at the cookie cutter conformity of the 1950s, but also examining the ways in which it did not include everyone in America. The suburban cookie cutter world, established in the 40s and 50s, was a world in which gender roles were emphasized in a way that said women belonged in the home, they were mothers, and they were wives. Many women embraced this idea, especially after World War II. They wanted to return home, have kids, and do all the things that they couldn't do during the war and during the Great Depression. But not all of the women involved in this cookie cutter conformity world were happy with the new gender roles. Part of the problem was the baby boom. Between 1946 and 1964, the average American family had 3.5 children, and the responsibility for caring for those 3.5 children fell on mom. That's a lot of labor in the household in order to take care of Junior and Junior and Junior. Not only that, this is a world of conformity in terms of the material culture. And the ability of Americans to purchase on credit, thanks to the invention of the credit card, meant that the home life was not only dominated by raising kids, it was dominated by a lot of materialism, a very consumer-oriented world, leaving a lot of women by the end of the 1950s almost feeling shallow or empty. Like they bake brownies, they go to PTA luncheons, they do the garden, and at the end of the day, they just didn't feel like they had an identity of their own. Television reinforced these cookie cutter roles. The TV sitcoms of the era featured white families solving really mundane problems in 30 minutes or less. Very few sitcoms featured people of color, one exception being The Beulah Show, which you can definitely catch on YouTube if you'd like to watch it. But even that show reinforced the domesticity of the 1950s. So Beulah is the black maid of this white family, in which mom sews and takes care of kids. Beulah is the queen of the kitchen. Dad goes off to his job and then comes home in the evening, expects his, slipper and newspaper, a glass of something to relax him. The other white families on TV shows typically featured a mom, a dad, and kids. When there were problems, they weren't severe problems. They were misunderstandings. They were easily solvable. No crime, no real vice. Many of these roles of the home and the family are reinforced by church. Church attendance increases 50% in the decade of the 1950s as Americans are saying God is on our side. The communists are godless. They do not have, a faith to hold on to, but God is with us here in America. And what God wants is for mom to be in the home and to take care of the kids as dad goes to work. This intense religiosity in the 50s actually resulted in the words under God being added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. So the original pledge did not have that phrase in it. And in fact, to further align our love for God as well as our love for capitalism, In God We Trust was added to money in 1956. Once again, making clear the linkage between the American capitalist consumer culture way, religion, and being victorious in the Cold War. And mom's place in the kitchen was all part of this story. The baby boom, of course, required a great deal of labor from mom and extended family as well. When mom needed a break, so many children are born in this time period that today we call them the boomers. So, okay, boomer is a phrase that refers to this baby boom generation. Many of the women of the time period turned to Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care to look for advice on how to raise kids. And this was a best-selling work that also reflected the era's trust and deep appreciation for expertise and authority figures. The consumer-oriented world of the 50s featured a lot of domestic imagery. So mom, the wife in the lovely final frost barrier. Just imagine this, frost-free world, frost-proof world set against, of course, the idea of the Cold War. And of course, as the ad says, you'll feel like a queen. I don't know about you, but I've never felt like a queen or a king in front of my refrigerator. Advertisements featured celebrities just as they had in the 1920s. So here, future President Ronald Reagan is advertising lung cancer for Christmas. He's going to send Chesterfields to all his friends. The 1950s is the origin of America's preacher, the Reverend Billy Graham, one of the most well-known faces of evangelical Christianity in the mid-20th century, an ardent anti-communist. He proposed to link being a servant of God to the American way and to what exactly would be the right way to live for all Americans. And his revivals featuring dynamic preaching as well as the misspelled glorious music promised Americans that if they just gave themselves over to this higher power, then they could find comfort and solace in the midst of an age of deep anxiety. The centerpiece of family life in the 1950s home would have been the television, such a dramatic way of bringing culture and media into the home, not unlike what radio does for the 1920s. The Zenith Black Magic television, no other gift can give so much. Nothing. Literally, it's TV. As the family gathers around and watches in glorious black and white, easily solvable problems on the numerous sitcoms and shows of the era. faces in those sitcoms would have been largely white, all white families for the most part, two parents, no drug and alcohol problems, no real crime, no vice, just a good, easy time of it, in which it's almost not even really connected to the real world. So, for example, in the I Love Lucy show, there's Lucy and her husband, Ricky. They sleep in separate beds because to depict them as sleeping in one bed might imply sexual activity, and that's a no-no. You know, there won't even be a flush on television from a bathroom until the 1970s because I guess apparently in the 1950s, nobody poops. The other center of the home would have been the kitchen, where mom, dressed in her finest, face made up. Why is she wearing heels to cook? She's a domestic goddess, of course. Glorious as she wears her pearls to put the roast in the oven. These advertisements and other pieces of media from the 1950s emphasize the glorious domesticity of the kitchen world, with the wife producing beautiful dinners and cakes and pies, glorious food, just whipping it up just as easy as you please. In fact, the kitchen became the centerpiece of international Cold War debate. Here we have Vice President Nixon and the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and they are debating the relative merits of the United States and the Soviet Union in a model kitchen display, with Richard Nixon claiming that America treats its women better because we give them dishwashers and washing machines and all the modern conveniences of, you know, what could be found in a kitchen. I think it telling that Khrushchev, in the midst of this debate, talks about how the Soviet Union allows women to be doctors and lawyers and other professionals. So clearly, America is thinking in this sort of tunnel vision that the domestic sphere is proof of the superiority of the American way. You want to reinforce domesticity? Give your wife a Hoover for Christmas. She'll be happier. She doesn't want pearls. She doesn't want diamonds. She doesn't want your undying love and affection. She wants a vacuum cleaner. And you know, the harder she cleans, the cuter she looks. She's never been more beautiful as when she is feather dusting the living room. I find this chart striking. This comes out of Phoner. The average daily television viewing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Striking that by the 70s, the average daily viewing is 5 hours and 54 minutes. Who, average daily viewing, 5 hours and 54 minutes? People are consuming a lot of media. I would suspect today, though, our average screen time might appear close to these numbers if we were to think social media instead of television. Not everybody fits in this cookie cutter world. There's obviously the cookie cutter imagery, the sort of ideas of what it should be like, and then there is reality. And the reality is there are a number of people who do not think this conformist, this authority-driven world actually feeds and nourishes the real, authentic human spirit. So these cultural critics condemned conformity. How's that for alliteration for you? By pointing out that Americans have lost a lot of their individuality, a lot of what makes them truly uniquely American. People like William White, who wrote The Organization Man in 1955, People like David Reisman, whose book, The Lonely Crowd, comes out in 1950. You've got Vance Packard, who writes The Hidden Persuaders, another book that appears in 1957. When you look at all of these books together, I'm not going to tell you the themes of each book separately, but when you put them all together, their chief concerns are that Americans are very much driven by mass culture, which is fed by advertising, making them very homogeneous, very samey, very much not individuals, not authentic, not real. So this shared culture of everything being the same, everything being alike, everything looking alike is really stultifying. It is, in fact, thoroughly against what America really is about, at least historically, in their opinion. So whether you're looking at the organization man, the man who focuses only on others, or the lonely crowd, the idea that we're all the same and yet we feel empty, or whether you're looking at advertising, the message is the same. Americans lack individuality. They lack that joie de vivre, the sort of like zest for real life that has characterized America, at least historically. Part of the problem is the idea that they have got to keep up with the Joneses. That is, they've got to match what their neighbors do. If your neighbors get a new car, you need to get a new car. You got to keep up. If your neighbors upgrade their house in suburbia, you got to upgrade your house in suburbia. So we're constantly pegging ourselves against the people around us. You know, what are they doing? And how can I match with that? Because to be different is to be outside of the norm, outside of the culture. And then maybe you're a communist. Youth culture is also not too happy with this cookie cutter conformity. The youth world becomes driven by their love of that devil's music, rock and roll. It's seductive. The other chief worry that adults have about teens is comic books. And there is quite a huge change in how comics are produced in the 1950s. There are comic codes which are designed to regulate the portrayal of various issues in the comic books, because both rock and roll and comics, according to the adults of this time period, are seducing their kids. Kids are being exposed to sexually liberating ideas, things that they should not know about. The kids are being exposed to communist ideas in many of these comic books. Kids are being exposed to godless behavior. That's not what Jesus would have wanted. He does not want you listening to that devil's music, watching those stars shake their hips as they sing seductively. Shake, baby. Shake one more time for me, as Jerry Lee Lewis would sing. And many of these critics of youth culture are worried that teens are being led to cross racial barriers. If you like an African American artist, maybe you'll like African Americans. Maybe you'll hang out with African Americans and you'll come to like African American music. And then suddenly, what do you know? Your daughter comes home with a black boyfriend. So rock and roll might teach you to transgress these racial barriers. And you know, black people aren't allowed in suburbia. Another group of young folks known as the Beatniks really challenged the cookie cutter conformity of this era. The Beatniks are artist and poet types, and essentially they look at the culture of conformity in the U.S. and they say it's utterly banal. Brinkmanship is bonkers. It makes no sense for Americans to be living in this constant atomic cloud of fear where they're just driven to sameness. The Beatniks wanted an exciting life that just sort of rose up in sparks and seized the joy of living. They expressed a lot of their ideas in poetry, using drugs to experiment with, thinking about the world differently, chilling out, relaxing. Pot is one of their favorites, some LSD as well. So what they're doing is challenging this idea that America has to be narrow and focused, and we got to go to church, and we can't take drugs and other illicit substances because that's not what God wants. And also, if we do that, then the communists might win. Most famous name among the poets would probably be Allen Ginsberg, whose 1955 poem Howl absolutely caused a stir because of its use of the F word, the four-letter F word. Ginsberg, who was gay, also, of course, challenged sexual conventions. The poem itself, which I encourage you to read sometime, is almost this stream of consciousness outpouring of just image upon image upon image upon image. At one point in the poem, he says he's vomiting, yakety-yakketing facts and spitting. And that really is what the poem is like. It's just this mind that's just been emptied out. Many of the faces of rock in the period were African American, but of course they would not be treated the same as white players of the genre of rock and roll. And oftentimes, white rock and roll artists steal the music of African Americans and they repackage it for white audiences. So, for example, Elvis Presley's Hound Dog. There is a black artist, Big Mama Thornton, who sings Hound Dog. And her Hound Dog's quite different from Elvis's a little bit upbeat version. But then, of course, Elvis slows it down towards the end and shakes his hips. And then Hound Dog becomes a little bit more sexual, which is why he wasn't allowed to be shown from the waist down when he sang it on television. The Beatniks were really poets and adventurers, but they were often portrayed in the media as wild rebels. Um, they are, mutinying against society. They're dangerous. They can get on their motorbikes and ride through town and destroy things. Yeah. But in fact, a lot of them just jam sessions of poetry and music, get high, explore consciousness. Another group of people who were shut out of the cookie cutter conformity of the 1950s would be African Americans, because they're denied living in these suburban towns. And of course, Jim Crow is still in effect. But they're not going to take it much longer. Because of the legacy of Double V in World War II, where they said we want victory at home, victory abroad, we're not going to fight the Nazis and then come home and just live with Jim Crow. The 40s and the 50s start to see organized resistance to America's historical legacy of segregation and racism. One way that shows up in 1954's Brown v. Board case, which struck down segregated schools. It's a famous case because you think of the little young girl, Linda Brown, being denied able to go to the school closest to her because she's got to go to an all-black school. In fact, it's actually several cases melded together, and it's a response to Plessy v. Ferguson, which came earlier in 1896. to say that segregation is not equal. In fact, to segregate is discriminatory, and it teaches young children, young black children, to believe that they are in fact inferior. Southerners were not having the Supreme Court tell them what to do, and they responded with a campaign of massive resistance to resist integration, saying states' rights, states' rights. So the Southerners in Congress signed a Southern Manifesto. They're going to try to do everything they can to stop what the Supreme Court's doing. And Southerners find lots of ways to fight integration of schools. You can close down schools and just not have school for a year. You can turn the schools into private schools and send all the white kids to private school and deny entry to, African American students. You could token integrate, like we'll just let in one kid, like on South Park, the black kid named Token, and therefore we can claim we've integrated, got one, done. So there are lots of ways to slow down resistance. Violence is not out of the question. That's followed up in 1956 by the Montgomery bus boycott, which ends discrimination on these buses in Montgomery, buses that are primarily used by the African American population. It's again also a famous story. Rosa Parks, too tired, doesn't want to move seats, gets arrested, launches a movement. In fact, the story is a lot more complicated than that. And there are a lot more women involved. We typically associate this as a story of Martin Luther King Jr. showing up and showing everybody how to lead and do the right thing. But in fact, women like Joanne Robinson, the local NAACP there in Montgomery, are pushing and leading the way before MLK shows up. Rosa Parks. There's even a young girl that they try to get to take the Rosa Parks approach before Rosa, named Claudette Colvin. After more than a year, finally the bus company does give in and says we will no longer segregate on buses, so the boycott works. Now notice, we've had two approaches already here in the 50s. Brown v. Board is a law case. Sue, 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 go to court. Lawsuit, lawsuit, lawsuit. The Montgomery bus boycott taps into an older American way of fighting, what Americans did during the American Revolution when they boycotted the British, the non-importation agreements. Does that ring a bell? So you're using consumer power here to say we're not going to spend money in a company that treats us like second-class citizens. And of course, not new. African Americans had done that before in other campaigns. The federal government's role in all of this was largely through the courts and the president's actions. And we see Truman and Eisenhower both increasingly willing to say, we're going to do something about civil rights, which is a shift from, remember, FDR won't even sign on to an anti-lynching bill because it'll cost him Southern support. But both Truman and Eisenhower take on this new role of being the presidential guardian for the civil rights movement. I mean, they're not moving very fast, but they're certainly doing more than their predecessors had done. A good example of that is Eisenhower, Ike, when he used the Army National Guard to integrate Central High School in Little Rock in Arkansas. And this, of course, is the famous Little Rock Nine, which many of you have probably already heard of before, in 1957. And that's a pretty bold move to say the court has ordered integration. I'm actually going to enforce it as president. I'm going to uphold the law. And so I will use military force to make that happen. Interestingly, it's a bit of psychology that leads to the conclusion in Brown v. Board. We've got here a young African American who's given a choice to play with two dolls. He picks the white doll, and the psychologist and his wife, who designed the experiment, Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, concluded that segregation taught African Americans that they were inferior. And when he asked, African American kids, why did you pick the white doll? They would say, white is better. White will have more fun. White will have a better life. I can imagine this white doll having better outcomes than I would have playing with the black doll. The black doll is not treated as well. So in the kids' mind, they had assumed black is inferior, second class. And this data ended up helping make the case for Brown v. Board. Southerners, interestingly, took the tactic of trying to claim that integration was communism. The mixing of the races is not only communist, according to these signs here, but is also the Antichrist. And so that's an interesting way of trying to use the language of the 1950s, the focus on anti-communism, as well as the renewed interest in religion, to try to link that to why you want to continue to be racist. We're going to end with a rather sad story about how these victories were also accompanied by some tragedies. The young man pictured here is no older than many of you. This is a young man from Chicago who decided to go down and visit his family in the South in 1955. So this is the year after Brown v. Board. And young Emmett Till just happened to have gotten into a situation where he's accused of an inappropriate conversation with a white woman. A white woman who has since recanted that story and said actually he didn't say anything to her that was inappropriate at all. But in 1955, she told her husband what he did. And that evening, her husband and other Southerners visited the place where Emmett Till was, and they kidnapped and brutally murdered him. Emmett Till's mother took the unusual and probably incredibly difficult step of deciding to have an open coffin, open casket ceremony for his funeral. And she wanted the world to see what Southern brutality could do to her baby. I don't know how a mother could do that. That had to have been like gut-wrenchingly awful to sit through. And she was willing to tell her story to the nation, to say court victories and integration in schools is not going to solve everything when we've got so much anger and so much hatred to deal with. The last image I'm going to leave you with is that image of young Emmett Till in the coffin. I warn you, it is incredibly graphic, and you may wish to click away and not look at it. It's going to take a long time before African Americans will achieve the freedom that they're looking for, a freedom that they sang about in so many songs of the civil rights movement. I'm going to leave you with one of my favorites. We Shall Overcome is a well-known one, but this is my favorite. Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. It's going to take a lot longer before the words of that song become true. I'll see you next time, scholars.